It's a tremendous pleasure for me to have here Hoenik Kwon. It was when we learned that he was available for this conference to give the keynote, we were absolutely thrilled because he's a referent in terms of the analysis of the social, political, familiar aspects of exhumations and massacres in Asia, in different places of Asia, particularly in Korea and Vietnam. He started out doing research in Siberia, which I'm going to switch to Spanish. Yes. Bueno, quería decir que es un enorme placer para nosotros tener aquí a Hoenik Kwon del London School of Economics, que nos va a dar una conferencia que se llama ¿Dónde colocar a los muertos de la guerra, ¿no? De la Guerra Civil? Que es una persona que es un referente mundial en estudios sobre traumas, sobre sociedades que han sufrido traumas extremos, como por ejemplo Vietnam y Corea, y ha trabajado en el entorno de exhumaciones. Tiene un libro que se llama After the Massacre, que es un libro publicado en el 2006, That's After the Massacre, que ganó el prestigiosísimo premio Clifford Geertz. Y claro, es un libro extraordinario desde todo punto de vista. Tiene otro libro que se llama los fantasmas de la guerra civil, los fantasmas de la guerra en Vietnam, que elabora también sobre las creencias populares que tienen los vietnamitas de los lugares en los cuales ha habido masacres, hubo masacres durante la guerra la guerra de Vietnam. Y es realmente un trabajo absolutamente extraordinario que nos va a presentar aquí. Él está trabajando en los últimos años, acaba de publicar un libro que se llama The Decomposition of the Cold War, la descomposición de la Guerra Fría, y es muy interesante porque es una muestra muy clara de cómo la antropología, partiendo de análisis etnográficos concretos en un lugar, en un pueblo, en una comunidad, en un municipio, puede plantearse problemas muy grandes, como es qué es lo que pasa con la Guerra Fría, cómo se expresa la Guerra Fría en la experiencia cotidiana de unas personas en un lugar determinado, ¿no? How Cold War can be expressed or expresses itself, in social relations at a very at the local level or village level.
It's amazing. I understand what you're saying.
Oh yeah. It's like a multilingual kind of. It's because I speak slow. I'm trying to speak as slow as possible.
Thank you.
So now, él también está especializado en temas de parentesco y en cómo se vincula todo el trauma social con las relaciones de parentesco, cómo se expresa, cómo se transmite. Yo creo que las personas que han estado en fosas comunes en España saben que el aspecto familiar, el aspecto político, es decir, hay un montón de niveles allí que intersectan sobre ello, y él se ha especializado en esta parte del parentesco. Entonces, para nosotros de verdad es un lujo tener aquí de keynote a Hoenik. La invitación fue más un atraco que una invitación, porque le invitamos hace relativamente poco tiempo y respondió inmediatamente en cuestión de horas diciendo sí voy, y eso es algo que para una persona del prestigio del doctor Kwon es realmente es un favor enorme que nos hace el poder estar aquí. Hoenik, it's all yours.
Thank you. Let me start. Es un gran honor estar aquí con ustedes. Perdóneme, no puedo hablar más en español. It's a real great pleasure. I think I take it as a very important gathering. And I'm one of those in the wide world outside Spain who are terribly interested in not necessarily the history of Spanish Civil War, but particularly how and in what way Spain will come to terms with difficult history, which I believe has enormous implications for the world at large. Let me start why I think what happens in Spain as to the difficult history of the Civil War is important for world over. The Spanish Civil War, I think, is a very, very particular event because it, in many ways, it opened the difficult times of the second half of 20th century. That, you know, if you consider this history within European history, it may look somewhat peculiar. But if you expand the second half of 20th century, let's say from late 1930s, what happened in Spain is hardly unusual, and Spanish Civil War and the difficulties the society had during the war is in a way, if I may say so, it's a kind of premonition of what the other peoples in the large world would experience in terms of historical destiny. So in that sense, what I'm saying is that we usually call the second half of 20th century, let's say since the end of the Second World War, as a Cold War. But as the novelist Garcia Marquez famously noted, for peoples in Latin America, the time of the Cold War was hardly a Cold War. And there was as he said, the peoples in Latin America had not had a moment's rest from the reality and threat of mass violence and mass death during the time that the historians and the outside world call the Cold War. So in a way, what happened in Latin America throughout the second half of 20th century, and large over, you know, in East Asia, starting from Korean War, and you can go as far as Chinese Civil War, and later on Vietnam War, and in 70s Africa and parts of Middle East. So basically, Spanish Civil War is exemplary history of global history, and it may look somewhat odd in European history because in Europe we tend to understand the era of the Cold War as a Cold War, as a period, an extraordinary time of international peace, and which which didn't see a major outbreak of major conflict among industrial nations. So Spain, I think what you do with the history of the Spanish Civil War and the after effects, the impact of this violent event on society has enormous exemplary value for global history, global modern history. We then know. And I have of course, in that sense, I have a very strong, the empirical interest in what happens in the historical memory of Spanish Civil War, including what Paco and other eminent colleagues do in forensic science, as well as in social studies of the after-war. But I have a particular theoretical interest in this field of ideas and activities, and that has a lot to do with my admiration of one of your artistic heroes, Pablo Picasso and his cohort, Cubism. For me, Cubism is not a genre or theory of art. It says so much about what to do with the progression of democracy in modern world. Basically, I think it's one of my favorite paintings. It's not painting actually. It's called Picasso's Scarf, which he drew for free for the Berlin Youth Festival in 1951. So thousands of participants in Berlin Youth Festival 1951 wore this scarf, and many of them still keep it. And it was his manifestation of certain vision of a peaceful world. And before he drew that, I mean, as you all know, that this single painting, what historians say, still the only visual representation of the human experience of modern war, that is, modern technological war, the aerial warfare. You know, the Spanish Civil War is very important in the history of military history as the beginning of aerial warfare, which whose meaning continues to reverberate in the contemporary world, and how to render the human experience of this mechanized aerial warfare was a very visionary effort indeed. And sometime afterwards, he did in the same year as he drew the dove scarf for the Berlin Youth Festival, he painted another famous painting, less known in Spain, but elsewhere very well known, Massacre in Korea. And if you look closely, what is not present in the Guernica, in his 1937, Guernica is present in Massacre in Korea. In the background, kind of the mythic landscape, the hill, there is actually a mass grave. So his artistic attention was squarely focused on the creation and the materiality of mass grave, and almost like as a premonition for what we are here gathered to do and talk about today. So, but my interest in the history of Spanish Civil War and the history of art history, I mean, the history of art movement, artistic creativity in the relationship between these two, goes to one of the central spirit of Cubist movement. And so I'd like to touch upon that element of artistic creativity in dealing with vexing historical memories, such as that of a civil war, shortly. But before I do that, let me introduce two other figures from history of modern European thought, in order to bring us closer to the power of Cubist art movement in dealing with the problems of historical memory. First, and before I speak about these very kind of skeletal and hopefully useful intellectual heritage, let me open up my today's talk with an episode from another civil war, a theater of a civil war, but somewhat further away, but in the Americas, but not in the South, but North. We tend to forget that one of the most powerful nations in the contemporary world, two powerful nations in the contemporary world, if you like, both United States and China, have a very, very powerful history of civil war in their founding history. Let's leave China for a moment aside. So what I'm trying to say is how the political community or political society in general deals with the foundational history of a civil war has a huge implication for the moral fabric and the political future of their particular society. But let me start with the one episode from the American side, the American Civil War. In 1862, in a place called Perryville, Kentucky, state of Kentucky, a man named Hawkins aimed, this is reported in local newspaper, aimed and shot a target within a group of enemy soldiers 20 feet away. And later it turned out that the mortally wounded enemy soldier was Hawkins' younger brother. And according to the local paper that featured the story, Hawkins aimed at the man purposefully, not by mistake, knowing that the target was his own brother. And after shooting him, Hawkins approached his brother and gave him water and blanket. And later, after the day's fighting was over, he returned to the scene and stayed with his dying and agonizing brother for the night. So he saw through the very painful death of his younger brother, the death he himself caused. So the local Kentucky newspaper described this scene, this action, as a proof that Hawkins was, this is a quotation, a man of family. And Amy Taylor, in her recent book called Divided Family in American Civil War, and accounting this story, asked, this is also a quotation, how could a man simultaneously shoot and embrace his own brother, unquote. So this story, a story such as this, I mean, those of you who actually professionally involved in uncovering the histories and human dramas of modern civil war must be familiar with this sort of mysterious thing. This happens in the theater of civil war. The misery and inhumanity of a civil war is fundamentally about the possibility of shooting one's own blood brother out of commitment, one's own commitment to a particular ideology of political brotherhood. So this story raises deeply unnerving questions about political ideology and human kinship, and how in a divisive civil conflict, the ideology of political brotherhood, brothers in arms, united under a certain artificial political ideology, can radically contradict and sometimes overpower the ethics of kinship and pre-political human brotherhood. These human consequences of modern civil war, especially those involving mass popular mobilization, as well as vicious bipolarization of society, such as Spanish Civil War, are often felt in the society long after the guns go silent. Why? Because the effect of this violence seeps into the domains of most intimate human relations, such as families, between siblings, between parents and children, and sometimes between wives and husbands and lovers. So modern war in this domain is not merely a clash between states. If we follow the classical doctrine about modern war proposed by political philosophers or political scientists, this reality of modern civil war is not very visible. So modern war is also about bitter disputes between the state and the family and between communities. And these disputes may be barely heard on the street while the drum of war is being beaten, but these drumbeats can never truly silence the family's disquiet voices or quiet is anxious nerves. The remarkable German artist Kate Coleridge, whose work actually influenced people like Picasso, lucidly depicted, and she lost her son and grandson first in the First World War and Second World War. During the interwar era, the anguish and anger held tight in the place that an enlisted man in faraway battlefield calls the family home. So she's one of the early artists who tried to shift the perspective to the human experience of war from the battlefield to home, from the public, this chaotic battlefield to anxious domestic space. So it is, there's the hidden space of domestic anxiety she tried to bring out to the foreground of representation. So the clash between the family and the state, and then she also is very well known with a painting of a mother looking for her missing son's remains, the battlefield. So this clash between the family and the state in modern warfare may continue after the war is over, and even after the dead bodies are brought back home. So who will determine the destiny of these bodies? And who has the right to decide the home, the geography, and the place of their afterlife? And these questions have been central to the theory of politics since at least the time of Hegel, who understood how intensely the question of a soldier's burial can complicate a family's political life, and how powerfully an inappropriate burial can shaken the family's moral ties to the sovereign order. But the experience of civil war poses added complications to the post-war society. Civil war is not just another war. It's got this added complexity. And one of those complex questions a civil war poses to post-war society is what will happen to the bodies and souls of the dead whose sacrifice in war cannot be recognized as a meaningful death by the broad political community after the war is over, for the simple reason that their death does not make into the category of a good and glorious death, as this is defined by post-war political community. And worse, how may the communities and families related to these publicly unaccounted for, unaccountable memories of the dead come to terms with their memories in their private lives? How can they reconcile the disparities of commemoration between the wider political society and the intimate communal lives? And this is not an unfamiliar issue. The philosopher Hegel based nearly entirety of his political theory of the ethical foundation of modern state on this question of what to do with the dead soldier's body. The famous, Hegel's famous interpretation of the Greek legend Antigone. Antigone has two brothers, Polynices and Eteocles. Eteocles dies as a hero of a city-state, so his memory is enshrined, and the public lamentation is enacted for him, whereas Polynices died as a traitor, as an enemy of that particular city-state, so his body is rotting outside the wall of that city-state, open to vultures. And so no funeral, no culturally appropriate funeral is allowed. And actually the state passes the edict that anyone who gives a burial to that enemy of the state will do so on the pain of death. So this question of two brothers, both are brothers to this woman Antigone, and she gives burial, the entire city gives burial to one brother, but she's not permitted to do the same for the other brother. So there is a confrontation between the ethics of kinship and the moral claims by the state. And as you know, Antigone tries to defy the state rule and gives a very symbolic burial to her brother Polynices and subsequently condemned to death. So much of what Hegel deliberates on is how a society will overcome, in which way it will overcome this incredible moral hierarchy between two deaths, whose meanings for this woman who gives symbolic burial to her eldest brother is the same for Antigone giving burial to her one brother or another brother has the same meaning, whereas from the perspective of the state, giving burial to one particular soldier is entirely different in meaning from doing so for the other. One is a legitimate and virtuous act, the other is treacherous and morally degenerate act. So this confrontation between moral claims from the state and ethical voices of the family and how to reconcile these clash between two, in a way, equally legitimate claims constitutes the ethical foundation of modern democratic state. And in the discipline of anthropology, I'm involved in, and Paco as well, and some of us, the same question has been very, very central in the development of the discipline. And particularly notable in this trajectory is a man named Robert Hertz. He was very close, one of the favorite pupils of Emil Durkheim, and one of the closest friends of Marcel Mauss, one of the founding member of modern sociology, French school. And he himself was killed in the Battle of Somme in 1915, very early on. But before he was conscripted to the First World War, and sadly his life cut short, his eminent career, academic career cut short in 1915, he wrote this piece called Preeminence of the Right Hand. So his question was, why on earth, in organic metaphor, human body requires two hands to play music or to do anything? To be a homo favor, you need two hands. Whereas in public discourse, right hand is always associated with justice, righteousness, or the right, law, whereas the left hand is something sinister, something other than righteous and lawful. And so what happened in the progression of human civilization? There's equally valuable human hands are sucked into this incredible hierarchy of values. And so then how this hierarchy of value in Hertz's work is expressed most forcefully across cultures and societies in the ways of dealing with the dead. So, he draws upon a lot of Southeast Asian ethnography in which people actually, when they deal with their ancestral death, they use only the right hand, and the good hand, whereas the left hand, the function of left hand is mostly for things that the society considers as polluting. And so Robert Hurt's question is, this moral hierarchy of death between good and bad, and good death and bad death, and how the social hierarchy is based on this moral hierarchical notion of good death versus bad death, and how we can envision a society, what he calls free from this grip of moral hierarchy. And toward the end of his very influential work, he coins this term of ambidexterity. He says it's a social and symbolic ambidexterity. So how, rather than thinking of a democratic society other than the presence of moral hierarchy, how ordinary people, ordinary citizens of a political community revive their interest in the fate of bad death, morally condemn the traces of death in that particular society, and how in their worldview and attitude and ritual practice become ambidextrous. So they can make a tribute to what the political community considers good death, but at the same time turn around and pay respect to what the community considers as elements of bad death. And through this ambidextrous social action, how society can gradually, with great effort, overcome the given hierarchy of values. So these, Robert Hurt wrote about these things, and around the same time, I think, similar questions were raised by scholars or practitioners. I mean, the intellectuals and the practitioners involved in art movement in the beginning of 20th century. And I think one of the eminent members of that movement is Pablo Picasso. So I think, in my view, what Cubists tried to do was, in a way, in the night before the outbreak of the First World War, the portrait paintings, or wall paintings, if you like, if you go to Imperial War Museum, I'm sure the same is true in a beautiful place, a world-renowned place like Prado in this town. If you go to pre-20th century portraits or paintings relating to history of war, very typically, there is one man at the center, whether it is eminent Spanish general, or as in the case of Imperial War Museum, Duke Wellington, or in French case, Napoleon or all these people, usually on horseback. And you don't see much else really, because the background, the battle scene, or the background of battle scene, what goes on with these ordinary foot soldiers and etc. is irrelevant. I mean, that is relevant to the extent that this background can empower the centrality of this central foregrounded figure, the hero. But the modern art movement in the beginning of 20th century, particularly Cubist movement, tried to undo this and tried to democratize the space of representation, the space that is invisible in the name of this negative space of background. So between this hero as the central figure, and the invisible margins in the background, how to create certain democratic relationship between these two spatial forms, kind of contributed to and ended up in breaking down the coherence of the spatial organization, and it decomposed the spatial structure. And then from that, I took this concept of decomposition of the Cold War. So in the beginning, in the First World War, if we look at Picasso's earlier work and Guernica, it is in line, in continuation of efforts such as Kate Coleridge, that how to render this utterly dehumanizing and alienating experience of aerial bombardment from bottom up, from the perspective of those who experience it, right? And then rendering this experience in many complex forms that from multiple perspectives actually makes the picture very apparently unintelligible and chaotic, but there is a serious message. And so, and the question in the representation of civil war is, again, in 1951, is how to bring out, this is the machine-like robotic soldiers, the mechanism of modern technology of war, and this naked women and children, the helpless human subject, and how to bring these two subjects, not necessarily the violence that happens between these two groups, or one group against the other, but how to bring these two, in a way, subjectivities of modern warfare into meaningful and equal partners in the representation of war. So I think there is much in that effort, and the spirit of this effort continues to the present time. So with that note, how much time do I have? Yeah. So let me, this is kind of like broad interest that I have. That of course, I'm interested, as I said, the fact that how the global space of the Cold War in the wide world was actually death world, and from Latin America to East Asia, and how our conception of the Cold War is not as a really Cold War, does not really help us in grasping the fact that this history of the Cold War was not hardly a Cold War. And these conceptual questions are vital for relating events in Latin America in 1960s and 70s and even 80s to the earlier tumultuous experience the East Asians underwent in the 1950s and Southeast Asians in the 1960s and 70s. So these global terrain of mutually interconnected experiences, all, I think, both in conceptual terms as to do with this, such as history of Cubism, and also chronologically, because it really did start in this place, in this country, even before the major part of Second War started in the late 1930s. So it all comes back to the history of Spanish Civil War and what scholars and students and intellectuals and general public and political society in general will do in coming to terms, and better coming to terms with its exemplary history, will have enormous implication for other nations and peoples. So I'm just wanting to emphasize once again that what you guys do here is not necessarily for Spain or bringing two Spains, divided Spains together, but means much more. But for the remaining time, because personally, I worked as a chief external advisor to South Korea's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which closed in December 2010. Sadly, it was supposed to continue, but it was closed up. And then I did work very extensively in collaboration with a group of forensic anthropologists as well as student volunteers, just as it's happening here for 5 years, summer and winter. And so let me turn from this somewhat abstract part of my talk to more empirical and more the more empirical terrain on the one hand, on the other hand, somewhat further away from Europe. So the activity of South Korea's Truth and Reconciliation Commission was interlocked with progression of political democracy in the country. But let me start with, this is not part of my paper actually, I didn't write about this, but because I had a breakfast with a few colleagues, and this history is important, and so I'll try to improvise it. What happened? I'll get into what to do with this complex situation of a civil war experienced by ordinary people shortly. But this commission's activity starts with the fact that the establishment, the rise and fall of the life of military dictatorship, if you like, military dictatorship that has many forms. Some of them have very authoritarian, developmental, authoritarian characters. Some of them have a strong kind of, for historical reasons, have a particular ideological tone of fascism, but developmentalist, authoritarian military regimes. The life, at least in Korea, started with an assault against graves. So what happened was when military coup, I'm not going to bore you with this concrete history, but very briefly, when really military dictatorship started in South Korea in 1961, the first thing that the army elite who succeeded in coup did was to eliminate all the graves of civilian casualties of civilian massacres relating to the Korean War. So for a certain period before the military coup, when society was slightly liberalized, one of the first things that the civil society demanded was an accountability for the civilian casualties and civilian killings. And state, as is the case, is not very much willing to listen to these things. So the communities, villages, and town districts put their efforts together and did the first excavation. It's kind of really non-expert type of excavation, but which is equally meaningful. So they put they unearthed the graves, mass graves, and in some places they put, you know, in their own culturally appropriate way, tombstones and ancestral relics. And these mass graves, these mass graves, ancestral mass graves, were the first target of military dictatorship in 1961. So when the society began to be liberalized once again after the end of the Cold War, and as a geopolitical order, and again, one of the first things that the civil society had to confront was this old mass graves. But I must say that the mass graves of 1961 and mass graves of 2005 to 2010 are not the same mass graves. Generation has changed. Although some of the members of first excavation in 1961 survived, many of them were incarcerated at the time, and actually 2 of them received death penalties. And it is evident that what is contained in this mass grave must be so dangerous. The political rulers go to the extent of giving death sentences to the family members. But in any case, when these graves were being reopened, or new mass graves were located and excavated, and the remains contained in them brought to the broad air in this 5 years period from 2005 to 2010, the entire society, as in Spain, was divided as to the meaning and the relevance of this action, and continues to find a way of consensus, point of consensus, without necessarily succeeding in doing so. But this is ongoing activities, and due to changes in political arenas, and the commission was closed in 2010 temporarily, but I suspect that it can be reopened and its activity rejuvenated anytime soon. So this went on for 5 years, and the documentation, the huge quantity of documentation was gathered. And I think two things I would like to say about this effort. Beyond the legal, judiciary aspect, and forensic aspect, and scientific aspect, and all the public, the aspect of public reconciliation, the fact that state or a formal organization such as a commission, TRC commission, took on this particularly difficult history, as I said, contributed to dividing the large civil society possibly more than before, or unearthing the wounds that can be a point of division for the civil society. But that is one thing. I think it comes and it dwindles away. But I think it was absolutely positive thing to do, looking back, because not many people talk about it, but what this commission did and was immeasurable from local communities' perspective. These ordinary villagers who were never able to speak about their experience of civil war for past 50 or 60 years. When the state took the initiative of legitimizing the unearthing of this history with its stamp, so only then most of the locals, after long deliberation and hesitation, took the courage to come out to the public sphere and start speaking about their experience for the first time since the war was over. So, and it really did good for the elders and the survivors of this violence. It was virtually first time. And then some of them became ill after speaking about it because it affects your body. But in the end, I think most of them felt very much liberated by the fact that they were given the opportunity. And not always the case, but I think in most cases, in the long run, these activities, particularly the activities of touching the lost ancestral bones and seeing them and doing some ritual activities on behalf of these ancestral bones for the bereaved families and close relations who are related to these people, was very gratifying and moving experience. And in the long run, I think this helped for people actually have more humane and a life that we can call a human life in the village, in the communities. Although a community, I'll come to one community shortly, looks very normal from the outside, and children grow up there unknowing the hidden divisiveness of these communities. But many communities which experience civil war are viciously and deadly divided. And this dividedness is just not visible to people. And because the people who feel divided do not speak about it to their children or to each other or to the outsiders for that matter. But the Commission's activity, particularly in exhumation, and much more than exhumation, about this socially appropriate ceremonial activity to do with these graves of humans once walked on the earth, did good, I think, in the long run for the health and sustainability of many communities in this country. So, due to time, I mean, I have a few things that I would like to address. What it was like, how is it possible to imagine living in the lived reality, historical reality, lived reality of a civil war? Because this reality is not in history books. The historians have no way to elicit this lived reality of a civil war. They can elicit why civil war may take place or could have been avoided through documentary sources and diplomatic sources, but how ordinary people live through the civil war is not in archives because people don't talk about that, right? So one way to have some recourse to this, we have to understand at least a fragment of this historical experience in order to actually do a proper act of respect for these dead people, because these people experience that historical experience. Whether human soul survives the death or not is beyond scientific imagination. But when we do acts of tribute to these victims of history, we have to understand. We have to make an effort to understand their historical life. So one way I try to do is through a careful attention to languages and symbols. For instance, the people in Vietnam, where I worked for the Civil War history for many years, has this powerful metaphor of soido. Soido is a familiar expression for people of the war generation in the southern and central region of Vietnam. That is the South Vietnam, where that's so really the heat of the Civil War before 1975. And the soido refers to the Vietnamese delicacy made of white rice flour and black beans. So it's like, nice rice flour made sweet, but it's dotted with black beans, right? Used as a metaphor, it also conveys how people of this region experienced Vietnam Civil War from 1960 to 75. In this context, soido refers to the turbulent conditions of communal life when the rural inhabitants of this region were confronted with changing occupations by contrary political and military forces. Some forces of these many forces were morally more legitimate in history books than the others, but from the experience of the local, they were armed combatants. At night, the village was under the control of revolutionary forces, and in daytime, an opposite force of war came to occupy the place. Life in these villages oscillated between two different political worlds, asserted by means of two separate military forces, and the people had to cope with their separate yet common assertions for absolute loyalty, and with the condition of the world changing politically day and night over many nights and days, to the extent that this anomalous world sometimes appeared to be almost a normal world. So soido conveys a simple truth. that when you eat this sweet, you must swallow both the white and black parts. This is how the sweet is supposed to be eaten. And this is what it was like living the tumultuous life in the village seized under the brutal dynamics of Vietnam's civil and international war. So people do symbolize their historical experience, and it is our duty to carefully attend to these symbols to elicit at least a fragment of their historical experience. And this, in the theater of Korean War, the Koreans have many similar experiences. I mean, many similar metaphors. But for instance, one very eminent novelist, Park Wan-seo, speaks of a woman's enduring and troubling memory of Korea's Civil War, as if this was an alien object stuck in her throat, which she is neither able to swallow nor spit out. This is even worse than eating black and white, because you can't eat it, you can't get rid of it, you're stuck with it, right? And partly because Vietnam's Civil War ended and the Korean Civil War still continues. And the historical metaphors, and when I worked for Truth and Reconciliation, my main job was to, oversee these excavations, but at the same time to liaise with families, the bereaved families of the victims, particularly to do with the civilian killings. We are talking about some 300,000 civilians in organized massacres, and so I had a large number of opportunities to visit places, and I did work in a couple of places more intensively. But the unfinished histories of the Civil War, a generation or two generations after, were very clearly exposed to me, and I was very thrown back by this revelation. For instance, and then I realized that it is this domain, this particular domain of a Civil War experience, that we can think about a different form of traumas. So in the European literature, traumas are mostly associated with the like classical shell shock of First World War. This kind of the world turned upside down, is loss of sense and loss of order and loss of stability, right? But this sense of trauma is very much centered on the experience of combatants, and we don't see what happens in this domain, in the intimate domestic domain, or in other communal domains, that the enduring wounds of a civil war still shape and human lives, and whereas we don't see how it shapes, because those who are being shaped by it are not willing to talk about. So it is a challenging question, and it is also ethical question. Are we able to elicit what the victims not necessarily do not want to be elicited? Or how, if we reach an agreement that we have to bring some light onto this domain, in what ways we can pursue it? These are very important questions indeed, right? But in my own experience, I think disciplines such as anthropology is immensely helpful because it allows a shift of focus from individual experience to a social experience. So what I'm saying is, the traumas of modern civil war are not really embodied in the sense of embodied in a single individual, but embodied in relational context between those who are dead and those who happen to have survived, and many complex relations that, metrics of relations that weave this, this enduring historical world constituted by the living and the dead. So this relational trauma, the traumas experienced by the civilian population were very much social traumas, both in distinction to combat traumas, and more importantly because these were the traumas experienced by social persons and relational beings, rather than necessarily by isolated individuals and their separate bodies. So this actually, in literary rendering and ethnographic context, this relation or relational trauma appears to be a key word in the recent literature about Cold War era Civil War experience. And I would be interested to know whether the same is true in the context of Spanish Civil War history. And in the public world, the wounds of modern civil war may be the intimate histories of these wounds may be largely unheard of and invisible. But that doesn't mean that these wounds do not exist in actual lived communities. In my work for the South Korea's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and having the opportunity to talk to members of the community, I noticed that civil war traumas have multiple sides, incredibly varying loci, for instance. And then people were not entirely silent about this history. And throughout the post-war eras, they had ways to talk about their experience with very critical insight. For instance, in TRC Korea case, these people talked about their historical experience, even in very difficult circumstances of high military dictatorship, in whispered conversations among family and village elders, quiet talk among trusted neighbors during family ancestral death day ceremonies, especially death day ceremonies, in the silent agonies of parents who couldn't tell their children the true stories of how their grandparents died during the war. So, and some of them lied, and the act of lying about it always hovers around their life. The anxieties of aging parents who don't know how to meet death without knowing about and hearing about their children, whom they still want to believe are surviving in the wide world. In the furious self-expression of some forgotten ancestral spirits who intrude into kind of, Korea has this particular ritual activity, shamanic rite, and thereby, where spirits are invited, and thereby startle the family gathered there, unknown dead. And the anxious worries of two young lovers, there are many of these cases, in a village who don't understand why their families object to their marriage so furiously, without telling them any intelligible reason for doing so. And in the struggle of a gray-haired man who tries to reconcile with the memory of his mother, who he long believed had abandoned him, but who he later discovered had to abandon him in order to save him, while being forced to marry the villager who was responsible for the death of his father and grandfather. So these stories make up only a tiny fragment of the gigantic iceberg of a civil war human dramas existing and still unfolding in places like Korea. But let me end my talk, it's already part, rather than going on about these terrible stories, what actually, and I'm not very much willing to talk about what state organizations such as TRC Commission can do for the society, but what community can do for itself and for the broader public world. That's what I'm going to end with. And I did work in this beautiful island in the southern maritime border of South Korea. And the war started earlier than in Korea. The Korean War started in 1950 and ended nominally 1953. But due to the communist uprising in this island and the massive involvement of counterinsurgency activities, which actually devastated the whole island, this war started much earlier, in 1948. It's an island called Jeju. So I'll skip the history, but due to, as in parallel with the Truth Commission activities, we very closely collaborated provincial authority as well as provincial association of bereaved families and local association of bereaved families, village elders association, women's associations, and widows association. And so in a way, this prolific activity resulted in really exemplary kind of act of commemoration. And so this picture to your right is Jeju Peace Park, recently built. It's a beautiful park, and all the names of the dead and missing are inscribed, where people come and do a tribute to their families. And these names are according to village origins. And once a year, they do hold this the province-wide ceremonial activity, and kind of communal. And the one on the lower level is kind of community organized as a spirit of consolation. And in one village in 2005, and what happened in this village, kind of what the villagers actually did, what the state couldn't do, or broader society couldn't do, was a great kind of wake-up call for us. And so I frequented this village very often, and then took a great consolation in looking at this memorial. So let me very briefly introduce this memorial that I find there is nothing really extraordinary, but the history, how locals struggled to build this memorial, is quite extraordinary. So the village of the Hagi village is very, the reality of their Civil War experience is very akin to the idea of Soido, although it is Vietnamese in origin. It was really night one group and during the day another group. And so, of course, this oscillation between two radically different political worlds mobilized the villagers into the political military activities. So the villages were really well divided between two worlds. So, actually the village consists of two sections, which had traditionally kind of turbulent relationship between marriage arrangements and other things, nothing to do with the war, but this civil war magnified the divisivenesses to villages, and not entirely the case, but generally one side of the village was recruited, many of them, to counterinsurgency activities, and the other village to communist partisan activities. And so in a way, literally, the villagers were forced to kill each other. So, and in the beginning of 2000, and then being in Madrid, this eminent sports club you have, the district of this village area had rural kind of like a football tournament, and and one of the football team that represents one of the small segments of this village. There are two segments. One segment went to semi-final, and the other segment, the other football team, miraculously also went to semi-final. And these two teams representing two segments of the village, they didn't fight with each other, but fought with the neighboring villages. And each time, the football team representing one segment of the village. The extraordinary thing was people from the other segment cheered against their neighbors and in favor of the team from outside, right? So after this tournament was over, the village elders were outraged, and they thought, this can't go on. This is killing our spirit and our everyday life, morality. And then, I mean, there are other things like there are only two shops in the village, and one is owned by a resident of one segment, and the other segment rarely go to this shop and try to avoid this shop. In daily life, even if the other shop has only the thing that you would like to purchase. So after long discussion and great effort among villagers and in a voluntary effort, they managed to build this shrine. It's called simply Shrine for the Consolation of the Dead. And on the right-hand side, oh no, sorry, from your perspective on the left, there are two stones. And these stones are dedicated to the distant village ancestors and those who perished, sacrificed their life in the theater of the Korean War, including a few to the counterinsurgency activities. And those two stones on the right are dedicated to 330 village victims of the anti-communist political terror during the from 1948 to 1953. They are all, the same villages, but happen to be in broader discourse, belonging to different political trajectories. So let me end. And there is a poem inscribed in the back of one of those stones on the right. So let me end by introducing to you this somewhat moving poem. So it says, when we were still enjoying the happiness of being freed from colonial misery, and Korea was colonized before the end of Pacific War, 1945, by Japan, and when we were yet unaware of the pains to be brought by the Korean War, the dark clouds of history came to us, whose origin we still do not know after all these years. Then so many lives were broken, and their bodies were discarded to the mountains and the fields and the sea. Who can identify in this mass of broken lives a death that was not tragic? Who can say in this mass of displaced souls, some souls have more grievances than others? What about those who could not even cry for the dead? Who will console their hearts that suffered all those years only for the one reason that they belong to the bodies who survived the destruction? For the past 50 years, the dead and the living alike led an unnatural life as wandering souls without a place to anchor. Only today, being older than our fathers and more aged than our mothers, we are gathered together in this very place. Let the heavens deal with the question of fate. Let history deal with its own portion of culpability. Our intention is not to dig again into the troubled grave of pain. It is only to fulfill the obligation of the living to offer a shovel of fine soil to the grave. Our hope is that someday the bleeding wounds may start to heal and we may see some sign of new life. Looking back, we see that we are all victims. Looking back, we see that we are all to forgive each other. In this spirit, we all are together erecting this stone for the dead. May this stone help them finally close their eyes, and for us the living, may this stone help us finally hold hands together. Thank you.
Hoenik, thanks so much for this fantastic presentation, which has so many resonances with Spanish case, and in a sense, it gives more sense to the conference as we start to realize how many things we have in common while studying these processes throughout the world. I just wanted to tell you something about the Guernica. You have been talking about it very often, and also about Cubism. This picture in Spain, I don't know how much you know about it. Maybe you already know all of it, but it's still today is extremely controversial. Because as you know, it was in the U.S. For many years, because Picasso in his will said that the picture could only travel back to Spain when the Republic came back. That has never happened, but there was a negotiation after Franco died, and it was brought to the. As he also wanted to be with the main Spanish painters, with Velázquez and Goya and whatnot. So he wanted the picture to move to the Museo del Prado. So this is a very complex story, and I'm probably missing part of it. But it was brought to the Museo del Prado, but not exactly the Museo del Prado, but a nearby facility, because it was thought as the founding stone of the new contemporary art museum, which is the Reina Sofia. So he remained there for a few years until it was transferred against the will, so to speak, of Picasso, and it was moved to the Centro Reina Sofia, and is now the main picture they have in their collection. Some people say that, in concrete, a sociologist called Jesus Ibáñez, that the transition to democracy in Spain finished when the security crystal covering the picture could be removed, because there was no threat to it, so to speak. And so there is still an ongoing history of the. On the other hand, the Basque government, particularly nationalistic parties in the Basque country, claim this is ours, because Guernica is Basque suffering, so to speak. So they would try to move it to the Guggenheim Museum or to other, and that's a conflict which is around. But last week there was another conflict still, because in the Malaga Museum, I don't know exactly the details because I just read very fast in the news. There was an exhibition which started in Barcelona and then moved to the Picasso Museum in Malaga, with it was Picasso and the War, or something like that. And one of the relatives of Picasso, great-granddaughter or something, I don't know exactly what was the kinship, she said that this was political manipulation, and she accused the director of the exhibition of manipulating the memory and the art. So this is ongoing kind of the social, political history of this very picture that you have shown us. And so I just wanted to tell you that, I mean, this is just maybe it's a stupid question, but for me and for us and for many people in the room and in Europe, when we think about the Vietnam War, we think about in terms of a very powerful cultural industry in the US, which is like the Hollywood and all the movies that have been done, some of them extremely powerful. So I wanted to ask you, to what extent this has leaked down into the social environments in which you work, or if there is some kind of locally, both in Korea or in Vietnam, there is art production which is not European or American and doesn't belong to the mainstream cultural industry, because that would be very interesting to analyze.
Yes, thank you. Oh, I heard vaguely about this, but thank you very much. I would love to. I'll be very interested in knowing more about the fate of Guernica and Picasso as such. But I think it's in a way it's amazing. I mean, I think this Spanish society is amazing because it's such an eminent cultural history, and especially in art and philosophies. And I mean, you guys, I think being an anthropologist, being an anthropologist in modern times means that we see things in a pluralist way. You know, the world we live is a pluralist world, and we have to accept the fact that the plurality of human culture and human existence and ways to express human existence is very human, and is one of the virtues of being human, to embrace and accept this plurality. And in the case of Civil War history, it's very politicized plurality, and so we have to work even harder. But I think, even that sense of very refined sense of pluralism is very much thanks to, although we have to bring this eminent history of Spanish historical perspectivism, pluralism, closely to intellectual history, but this nation has a strong heritage of intellectual and art history, celebrating human plurality. So I think there is a great strength. And to do with Picasso, I mean, I'm more interested in, rather than the representational aspect of Picasso, of, like when we talk about Guernica, and it is, of course, it's a basket town, and it's kind of like, it's almost like a beginning of the modern world, really, in global terms. If First World War, Somme, Western Front, the death in Western Front was the beginning of European history, modern Europe. This was the beginning of modern Europe. I mean, after Guernica, after the bombing of Guernica, the aerial bombing has become a thing, trademark of modern world all over the world. So this artist's vision of that to represent a human experience in a kind of very conceptual way was enormous work of creativity indeed. But what I'm interested in this work and his other work, including Massacres in Korea, is that how to refine this this intellectual and cultural history of pluralism, historical pluralism, or social pluralism, or cultural pluralism, into a device is conducive for society coming to terms with its difficult path. So accepting the other's differences without negating the existence of differences, but at the same time not losing the hope that we will continue to deliberate on finding certain possibility of existing on the same space of canvas, despite the differences, and then the fact that we can coexist on the same surface, despite these differences, actually makes the rendering powerfully evocative and beautifully aesthetically pleasing, and this is in the spirit of modern art. So, and how different proponents of different differences can come to terms with this fact for the broad community, that this is what we have to bring, the way that we have to bring ourselves together into a realm and surface of coexistence is such a question that has so much at stake for the entire community, not for my own self. So I think this certain kind of very enlightened form of kind of pluralism that is so vital to anthropology, but also in parts of modern art, and particularly in the heritage that Spain eminently has, I hope that it will help you to make extraordinary creations in art, literature, and not only in kind of institutional forms of reconciliation and truth finding, but also in the production of art. And so how they can, when they are disseminated, it can actually affect the human emotions and anxieties elsewhere. But in relation to your second question, yes. But I think, in a way, what I try to say about this relational traumas, and then I think it's very, very prevalent in the Civil War literature. I mean, but the thing is, Vietnam is a revolutionary society for many years. It still is. So the publication of printing is much more controlled. I mean, even under military dictatorship in places like South Korea and or Taiwan, very much controlled, but still there was relatively more space to publish these things. So if you look at them, it's very much family dramas, family dramas, Civil War history as a family dramas, and what is missing in the family genealogy, and then the certain impacts, invisible impacts, this past history has for everyday life of the living. So let's say the two lovers kind of have a problem in realizing their love, and these people, the new generation, they had never heard of the complexity of local history relating to the Civil War. Maybe busy with other things, the Twitters and things, they are not particularly interested in it. But what they are not aware of is that the thing that they desire most is not achievable unless they know the past and deal with the past. So, and then not only between lovers, but also the generational conflicts, what parents don't say to their children. If parents don't say certain things about their past to children, it's not necessarily a blank page in history, but the existence of that blank page has a huge impact on the parental and children relations. So children grow up by being affected by that blank page. So their personality is formed partly, in large part, by the existence of the blank page. So this, how the old generation and new generation together in collaborative way have to confront these blank pages rather than relegating the solution to other generation. I think in that sense, I see in a kind of positive way that the large political history, such as a history of Civil War, can be rendered in intimate family dramas, although there is a lot of banality about it, but still it becomes manageable and it becomes intimate, so it becomes relevant to you. And so when it's relevant, and then we get on with it. So I think, so that these are, yes. Civil as a kind of in American Civil War, Civil War as a domestic conflict. That's very much, yes.
So now we can open to the floor. There's a microphone there if somebody wants to ask any question. There's one here. Victoria.
Thank you, Hoenik. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you,
I actually have a question about Jeju Island because you've been back there. I was struck at the museum when you enter, there was that plaque that didn't have a description, right? That it was empty because they hadn't decided what had happened there. My sense was the discussion was it genocide, was it not genocide? How would they name the event? And I was thinking in the symbolic, if you could talk a little bit about that, it would be very interesting. Thank you.
Yes, but the naming the event, because it's again, like if you are one of those people who commute on Eurostar all the time, right? What I'm saying is, each time you take Eurostar, this multilingual civilization is good, but it can get terribly boring. So it's first in French, German, and English, and in the Flemish, Dutch. So in order to get some work done, you have to put up with this announcement for 4 times or 5 times longer than it can be. So the respect to each linguistic integrity is good, and then it is what I'm proposing here. But at the same time, in some occasions, it becomes banal, and also it may turn out to be that by bringing these different voices in one space is something close to impossibility given the political context. So what I'm saying is the particular event that Jeju people experience is called April 3rd, in following the outbreak of communist uprising on April 3rd in 1948. So you can call it April 3rd uprising, or April 3rd rebellion, or April 3rd revolution, April 3rd revolt, and so these terms exist in the island as well as in Ireland's relations with the outside world, and then even within the same village there are different interpretive communities, right? And so depending on how so for a long while the islanders decide to put up with calling it kind of event, neutral concept, April 3rd event or incident, but nobody's happy with it. The event has to have a meaning, and if you call it genocide, it has a powerful meaning. So there are groups of people who want to change the name into genocide, and so because it is public sphere, and then there was a debate, whether how to accommodate these variant names for the event and the variant naming for the event, and of course I think the blank space, which is actually part of calling it as an incident or event, because it makes it blank, and then can turn out to be somewhat dubious and somewhat incomplete, but at the same time it is inviting, it is open, so you can come as someone who believes as April 3rd as a revolution, but still you can join this space in which the revolution is called as an incident rather than kind of revolt. So I think the locals are doing a very, very careful balance of power among themselves. And then what is more important? My relations with my neighbors, my humane life in everyday life than names. So I think when there was a lot of controversies, and historians are particularly really into naming, and then sometimes, I'm not generalizing, but some work by historians are very not very conducive for communal work, because they just absolutely want to name it, and then historians groups are completely divided between kind of revolt group and revolution group. But for people who do conduct everyday life, you just have to live with each other, and so you just can't negate the other's kind of way of naming things. And so in the names, the relevance of names may have much less relevance in this sphere of life, and then we have to look more closely in this sphere of life than elsewhere. But because the museum is a public space, and people expect what this event is all about, and it has to show and blank and makes you think. And personally I thought it was really well done. Yeah.
Well, we have now a coffee break for half an hour before we get started, and so Hoenik will be also available, and I hope that during lunch. One thing we want to do is to publish a book out of this conference, and I think that could be for one of the versions would be in Spanish, and I think it would be very important for Spanish people to be able, those who don't speak English, to be able to access your work, because it's extraordinary. And muchísimas gracias a todos, sobre todo a los que el inglés no lo tenéis así muy fresco a estas horas de la mañana. El resto de la conferencia va a ser toda en castellano. Hoenik Kwon va a estar ahora con nosotros durante el café y también durante la comida, y entonces podéis continuar preguntándole pues, algunos de los aspectos de toda esta experiencia de Vietnam y Corea de la que nos ha hablado. Muchísimas gracias, Hoenik.
Gracias.
Welcome.